That same afternoon, Emily sat on the porch swing, arms wrapped around her knees. The late spring breeze carried the scent of fresh grass and blooming jasmine, but she barely noticed it. Her eyes were locked on Max, who lay under the oak tree, watching her with unreadable eyes. Once, she used to nap beside him on a blanket and tell him stories about magic forests and talking animals. Now, she didn't even feel safe walking near him. She tried to focus on her drawing pad. Art had always been her escape. Today, she was sketching Max, trying to remember the version of him who used to nudge her hand with his nose and lick her face until she giggled. But halfway through, she stopped and stared at the paper. Even her drawing looked tense. His eyes were all wrong. Why don't you go do something useful instead of wasting time on that nonsense? Her father's voice came from the doorway. He was holding a coffee mug, the way he always did, when he wanted to seem casual, but WASN. Single quotes T. Emily flinched, but didn't answer. Roy stepped out, glanced at Max, then at her. If you keep annoying him, one day he might really snap. I won't stop him either. You need to learn your place. Emily's fingers clenched the pencil. She looked down at her drawing, not daring to meet his eyes. Roy turned and walked back inside, but not before muttering something under his breath. Max didn't move. He just stared, and Emily, for the first time in her life, felt truly alone. Across the street, behind her lace curtains, Mrs. Matthews took quiet notes in a little notebook. She had seen Roy approach the dog many times over the last few weeks. It wasn't just the commands he gave, it was his body language. He stood like someone in control, watching Max with an expression that wasn't love. It was satisfaction. Like he was waiting for something. Mrs. Matthews had raised 3 children and 1 stubborn bloodhound in her lifetime. She knew when something didn't add up, and Roy's behavior didn't. That evening, Emily sat in her room staring at a picture of her mother. It was the last photo they took together, Emily wearing a birthday crown, Max in a silly party hat, and her mum holding the cake with a big 8 candle. Everything in that picture felt like a different world. She held the frame tight and whispered, "I wish you were still here. I don't know what to do." The silence in the room was heavy. From the hallway, Max's claws clicked against the wooden floor, stopping just outside her door. He didn't come in. She waited, but all she heard was him turning away. Later that night, a loud thud woke her. Then another, and then a bark sharp and angry. She sat up in bed, heart pounding. Was Max outside her door? She tiptoed to the door and pressed her ear against it. She could hear her father's voice again, low and harsh, giving Max a command. Then silence. Emily backed away and climbed back into bed, pulling the blanket over her head. She didn't sleep. The next day at school, her teacher, Ms. Parker, noticed the deep shadows under Emily's eyes. "Rough nights?" she asked gently, as she crouched beside Emily's desk. Emily hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Max, he doesn't like me anymore," she whispered. Ms. Parker frowned. "Why would you say that?" "Dad says it's because I'm not strong enough, that Max can smell it." The teacher's stomach dropped. She didn't show it, but inside, alarm bells were ringing. She made a mental note to speak with the school counselor immediately. Back in the neighborhood, Mrs. Matthews placed a call to a friend she hadn't spoken to in a while, someone who had a connection to animal welfare. She wasn't sure what was happening yet, but she was determined to find out before it was too late. And in the blue house on the corner, Emily sat on the edge of her bed, wondering if her best friend would ever come back to her, or if the Max she once loved was gone for good. The sun filtered through the living room windows as Emily sat at the edge of the couch, carefully tying the straps on her leg brace. She had gotten used to the routine: tighten, adjust, test her step, but it never got easier. She usually had Max sitting beside her, nuzzling her side or wagging his tail in encouragement. Now, he sat across the room, stiff and silent, watching her with a gaze that felt foreign. "Good boy, Max," she said softly, hoping to spark some trace of the dog she once knew. But Max didn't respond. He looked away, uninterested. Roy entered the room, carrying a bowl of dog food. He didn't acknowledge Emily. He whistled sharply, and Max immediately trotted over, tail wagging slightly. Emily's heart sank. That small wag, the one that used to be meant for her, was now given to the man who barely spoke to her anymore. "You're really wasting your breath with him," Roy said, kneeling to set down the bowl. "He listens to strength. That's why he listens to me." Emily frowned. "He used to listen to me." Roy shrugged. "Well, maybe you were easier to handle back then." Max ate quickly while Roy stood over him, giving him a strange command, in a tone that made Emily freeze. She didn't recognize the words. but the way Max responded with immediate obedience made her uneasy. When Max finished, Roy gave him a pat. Good, you're learning. Emily stayed silent, her eyes flicking between them. Something in her chest told her this wasn't normal. It wasn't training, it was control. And it wasn't about Max being smarter. It was about Roy being louder. Later that day, Emily walked through the backyard, hoping to find a moment of peace. She took slow, careful steps across the grass, her brace pressing against her skin. She stopped near the fence, where she used to play fetch with Max. She remembered the way he'd run full speed across the yard, ears flying, bringing the ball back like a hero. She turned and saw him near the back door, watching again. She raised the old tennis ball she had tucked in her hoodie pocket and gave it a hopeful toss. Come on, Max. The ball bounced across the grass and rolled to a stop. Max didn't move. Instead, Roy stepped outside, arms folded. He's not your toy anymore. Emily turned toward him slowly. He's not a toy. Roy walked past her, grabbed the ball, and gave Max another sharp command. Max sprang into action, leaping toward the ball and retrieving it, but not bringing it back to Emily. He dropped it at Roy's feet and sat obediently. Emily's stomach churned. That evening, while Emily sat in her room with a coloring book she wasn't really focused on, she heard the sound of her dad and Max in the basement. Again, it had become routine. Roy would take Max down there at night, sometimes for hours, and Emily wasn't allowed to come down. The basement door had a new lock. She could hear muffled words and commands, thuds and scraping. Her mind wandered to terrible thoughts, and she hugged her knees tightly to her chest. A knock at the front door startled her. She heard her dad's footsteps. A moment later, voices. She tiptoed to the top of the stairs and listened. It was Mrs. Matthews. I'm just checking in. Her voice rang out. I haven't seen Emily lately, and she usually comes by with flowers. She's fine, Roy replied. Clipped. Busy with school. She doesn't need to be out bothering people. She's never been a bother. Mrs. Matthews said kindly. She's a sweet girl. I do miss her. There was silence. Then the door creaked shut. Emily scurried back to her room before her dad could catch her listening. Downstairs, Roy returned to the living room. He stood still for a moment, then turned toward Max. He gave another command, low and deliberate. Max barked once, sharp and loud. Emily flinched from upstairs. She knew, deep down, something was wrong. Not just with Max, with everything. But who could she tell? Who would believe that a man could turn a dog into something dangerous, not with fists, but with words? She didn't know it yet, but someone was already trying to find out the truth. The next morning, Emily dragged her feet through the school's front doors, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. She clutched her backpack tightly, her brace clicking softly with each step on the polished hallway floor. Her classmates walked around her, laughing, talking, moving like the world was fine. For Emily, everything felt different, colder, heavier. Ms. Parker, her sixth grade teacher, noticed the change immediately. Emily usually greeted her with a smile or a question about the classroom pet turtle. Today, she didn't even look up. As she entered, after attendance and morning announcements, Ms. Parker quietly knelt beside Emily's desk while the class copied notes from the board. You doing okay, sweetheart? She asked softly. Emily nodded without looking up. Ms. Parker gently placed her hand on the desk. I noticed you're not quite yourself lately. Emily hesitated. She glanced up briefly and gave a small shrug. Ms. Parker didn't push, but as she stood and walked back to her desk, she made a note on a sticky pad. Follow up with counselor. Emily Dawson seems withdrawn. During recess, while the other children played tag and traded snacks, Emily sat alone under the shade of a tree. She pulled out her drawing pad and started sketching Max again. This time, she drew him with a blank stare and tense posture, just like she'd seen him act at home. Before she could finish, a shadow fell over her. Hey, Emily, said Ms. Parker, gently sitting down beside her. That's a great drawing. Is that your dog? Emily paused, her pencil hovering over the page. It used to be, she whispered. Ms. Parker studied her face. What do you mean by that? Emily looked down. He doesn't like me anymore. What makes you say that? He growls when I get close. He listens to my dad now. Only him. Ms. Parker raised an eyebrow. Has he ever tried to hurt you? Emily shook her head quickly. No, not yet, not yet. The words rang in Ms. Parker's ears long after Emily walked back to class. That afternoon, Ms. Parker met privately with the school counselor, Mrs. Reed. She shared everything: Emily's withdrawn behavior, her concerning comments, and the growing feeling in her gut that something wasn't right at home. Mrs. Reed nodded, already pulling up Emily's records. There's never been a report filed before, she said. But that doesn't mean something isn't happening. I'll talk to her tomorrow. We may need to contact Child Services if this continues. Meanwhile, back in the neighborhood, Mrs. Matthews wasn't giving up either. After her brief conversation at the front door with Roy, her instincts had been screaming. She had known Emily for years. That sweet girl used to bring her drawings and ask about her garden. Lately, she hadn't even waved from the porch. Mrs. Matthews decided to take a bolder step. She called her nephew, Dennis, a retired animal behavior specialist who now volunteered with a rescue group. He had dealt with everything from abused pets to illegal dog training rings. I need your help, she told him. There's a dog across the street, used to be the gentlest thing. Now he's different. And the little girl in that house, she's scared of him. I can see it. Dennis promised to stop by later in the week and take a look, under the guise of checking in on his aunt. If something strange was going on, he'd see it. Back inside the house, Emily sat on the floor of her room, holding her mother's necklace. In her hand, she used to wear it during storms, believing it kept her safe. Now, she wore it almost every day. Downstairs, she heard the familiar sound of her father unlocking the basement. Max's nails tapped the wooden steps as they descended. Emily closed her eyes. That night, in the dark quiet of her room, Emily whispered into the silence, I just want my Max back. I just want to feel safe again. She didn't know that both her teacher and neighbor were already trying to help, and that soon, the truth would begin to surface one small act at a time by the middle of the week. Clouds gathered over the quiet Missouri neighborhood, casting long shadows over driveways and front lawns. That evening, a sudden thunderstorm rolled in. Lightning split the sky, and rain pounded against the windows. At the Dawson house, the power flickered twice before going out completely. Emily sat on her bed, hugging her knees, the glow from her small battery lantern casting soft light across her room. She wasn't scared of the dark, she was scared of what she heard downstairs. The low voice of her father, the short, sharp bark of Max, a command, a thud, then silence. Across the street, Mrs. Matthews watched from her window. Though her house had also lost power, she still had her backup battery camera system. She had one camera angled toward her porch and another one that caught a small part of the Dawson front yard, just enough to see movement. She didn't expect to capture anything unusual, but what appeared on her screen shook her deeply. Through the rain and grainy static, the footage showed Roy stepping outside briefly, looking around before turning back into the house. Moments later, Max appeared standing stiff at the doorway, growling low at something behind him. Then, for a flash of a second, Emily appeared in the frame. She didn't step outside, but her silhouette behind the window curtain was visible. Max barked loudly. Roy turned toward him, raised a finger, and gave a command. Max lunged at the curtain. Though the glass separated them, the intent was chilling. Mrs. Matthews' hands trembled as she rewound the footage twice, making sure her eyes weren't deceiving her. There it was. Roy deliberately signaling Max to react aggressively toward his daughter. The next morning, Mrs. Matthews didn't wait. She printed the frames and made a call to animal control, followed by a visit to the local child welfare office. Her voice was calm, but urgent. I believe a child may be in danger, and I think the dog's being trained for something no one should ever teach an animal to do. Within hours, a caseworker named Carla Ruiz and an officer from Animal Services, Officer Darnell, showed up at the Dawson home. Their visit was unannounced. Roy answered the door with a tight smile. Can I help you? We've had a concern raised about your daughter and your dog, Carla said. We'd like to ask a few questions and speak with Emily, if you don't mind. Roy's jaw tightened, but he stepped aside. She's in her room. Max is in the basement. Carla nodded, her trained eyes scanning the house quickly as she entered. Officer Darnell stayed near the door, but kept his radio close. Emily emerged a few minutes later, confused and quiet. Carla greeted her gently. Hi, Emily. I'm here to check on how things are going at home. We've just had someone say they're worried about you. Can we talk for a bit? Emily looked at her father, who didn't say a word. She nodded slowly. They moved to the couch, and Carla began asking simple questions. How school was, what Max had been like lately, whether anything at home was bothering her. At first, Emily gave safe, short answers. Then Carla leaned in a little closer and said, You know, you're not in trouble. And it's really important that you feel safe where you live. That's why I'm here. Emily hesitated. Then quietly, like a whisper in a storm. She said, "Max doesn't like me anymore. My dad told me it's because I'm weak." Carla's face remained calm, but inside, she felt the pieces clicking into place. "Has Max ever growled or barked at you when your dad was around?" she asked. Emily nodded. Only then. Outside, Officer Darnell had already requested backup. He'd seen enough cases to know when something didn't feel right. He needed to get Max He needed to make sure Emily was safe. As Carla finished the conversation, she turned to Roy with a professional but firm tone. "For now, we're going to place Max in temporary custody with the local animal center for behavior observation. We'll also be making a follow-up visit regarding Emily's well-being." Roy's smile faded. "That's ridiculous. The dogs. Fine." But it was too late. Officer Darnell stepped inside. "Sir, we'll need to take Max today." Roy didn't resist, but the look he gave Emily as they led the dog away chilled her to her core. Max, for his part, didn't bark or struggle. He looked back once at Emily, but this time, there was no growl in his eyes. Only something that looked almost like regret. And for the first time in weeks, Emily felt a crack in the fear that had surrounded her. Someone finally believed her. The house felt different without Max. Quieter, yes, but not in a peaceful way. It was the kind of silence that settled in your chest and stayed there, heavy and tense. Emily sat at the kitchen table, staring at her cereal, the spoon untouched. In her hand, across from her, Roy read the newspaper, pretending everything was normal. But nothing was normal anymore. Max had been taken just a day ago, yet Emily could already feel the weight of his absence, like a missing piece of herself. Even when he'd started acting strangely, she never stopped loving him. Losing him again felt like another hole opening under her feet. "You happy now?" Roy muttered, without looking up. "You just had to talk, didn't you?" Emily froze. He folded the paper slowly, setting it down with deliberate calm. "Now, they think I'm some kind of monster. All because you couldn't keep your mouth shut." "I didn't lie," Emily said softly, almost too quietly to hear. Roy leaned back in his chair, his face tight. "No, you just told them stories." "Same thing." Emily stood, not responding. Her heart was pounding, but she walked away from the table and returned to her room, where her suitcase now sat on the floor, half open. Carla Ruiz had returned earlier that morning and told her gently, "We're moving you into a safe place. For now, just until everything is sorted." Emily hadn't cried, not yet, but she could feel it building. Before she left, Carla gave her a hug. "You're brave," she whispered, "and you're not alone anymore." By that afternoon, Emily had been placed with the Andersons, a kind foster couple with a quiet home, 2 cats, and a backyard filled with bird feeders and sunflowers. Mrs. Anderson, a retired art teacher, offered Emily her own set of paints. Mr. Anderson made pancakes shaped like smiley faces. It felt strange but safe, like stepping into a different world. Still, Emily couldn't stop thinking about Max. At the city animal shelter, Max was being evaluated by Dennis Matthews, Mrs. Matthews' nephew. As soon as Max was brought in, Dennis knew something was wrong. The dog was physically healthy, but mentally strained. He flinched at certain sounds, froze when anyone raised their hand, and responded robotically to hand signals. No one at the shelter recognized Dot. Dennis had seen dogs like this before. Intelligent animals pushed into obedience through intimidation, not care. But something about Max was different. It was like the dog was fighting himself, trying to remember who he used to be. After 2 days, Dennis tried something new. He brought in an old t-shirt that Mrs. Matthews had kept, one of Emily's. A purple shirt with a butterfly on the front. Max sniffed it once. Then again, he whined, nudging the shirt with his nose. Then lay down beside it. That was the first sign. Meanwhile, back at school, Emily's classmates were starting to ask questions. Word had spread that she was staying somewhere else, and that something had happened with her dad. Her best friend Leela approached her gently in the cafeteria. "Are you okay?" she asked. Emily nodded, then surprised herself by saying, "I think I will be." She didn't want to lie, and for once, she didn't want to pretend either. Ms. Parker sat beside her later that day and smiled. "I'm proud of you." Emily tilted her head. "For what?" "For speaking up. For being honest. That takes more strength than most people realize." Emily smiled softly. The words sank in deep. That night, at the foster home, Emily painted for the first time in weeks. She drew Max, not the Max she had seen last, but the Max she remembered. His goofy tongue hanging out, one ear flopped sideways, his paw on her knee, as if to say, "I'm here." She didn't know where he was, or if he'd ever come back. But she hoped. And sometimes, hope was enough to keep going. The next day, Carla called. She had news, and everything was about to change. The call from Carla came just after dinner. Emily sat in the Andersons' living room, curled up with a book she wasn't really reading. When the phone rang and Mrs. Anderson handed it to her, Emily's heart thudded against her chest. "Emily," Carla's voice came through warm and steady. "I have something important to tell you." Emily sat upright. "Is it about Max?" "Yes," Carla replied. "He's doing better. He's with a trainer now who's helping him unlearn the things he was taught. And there's more. We've gathered enough evidence to take your father to court." Emily didn't speak. She didn't know what to say. Court had always seemed like something far away, for people in movies or on the news. Not for someone like her. "Will I have to go?" she finally asked. "Maybe," Carla said gently. "But only if you feel ready. And you won't be alone." That night, Emily lay awake thinking about the last few years. Her dad's silence. The way Max had changed. How the house that once felt safe had slowly become a place she feared. And how it all happened so quietly that no one noticed until now. The following week, the courtroom was filled with people who had come to support Emily. Ms. Parker sat in the second row. Mrs. Matthews came with Dennis, who had submitted a full report about Max's training. Even Leela's family showed up. Roy Dawson sat on the other side of the room, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He hadn't spoken a word since his arrest 2 weeks ago. His lawyer argued that there was no physical abuse, that he had every right to train his dog, and that people were overreacting to discipline. But the evidence spoke louder. Mrs. Matthews' footage was shown to the jury. So was Dennis's video of Max reacting to Emily's shirt. Carla testified about Emily's condition during their first conversation. And finally, Miss Parker took the stand. She was scared, she said, not just of the dog, of him. And she never said anything until she couldn't hold it in anymore. That takes courage. That's not weakness. When it was Emily's turn, the room went quiet. She walked carefully to the stand, her leg brace clicking softly. She looked small behind the witness table, but her voice, though quiet, was clear. "My dad used to tell me Max didn't like weakness," she said. "He made me think it was my fault the dog didn't love me anymore. But I never stopped loving Max. I just wanted him back." Her words brought tears to the eyes of several people in the room. After she finished, Emily returned to her seat beside Carla and held her hand tightly. It took the jury less than a day to reach a verdict. Roy Dawson was found guilty of child endangerment, psychological abuse, and violating animal safety regulations. The judge ordered that he undergo mandatory psychological treatment and would not be allowed contact with Emily or any animals until further notice. The courtroom remained silent as Roy was led away, his face pale and expressionless. Emily didn't smile. She didn't feel like celebrating. But she did feel lighter, like the weight she'd been carrying had finally shifted off her shoulders. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Reporters asked questions. People held signs of support. And someone handed Emily a small stuffed dog with a tag that read, "Stay brave." She clutched it gently, amazed that anyone even knew her story. Later that week, Dennis called with more good news. "Max is doing great," he said. "He's responding better every day. We're not pushing him, but I think he remembers." Emily's eyes lit up. "Can I see him?" There was a pause. "I think he'd like that." And just like that, something inside her heart opened again. A quiet door that had been closed for far too long. It was a bright Saturday morning when the call came. Emily had been waiting, barely able to sleep the night before. Mrs. Anderson picked up the phone, listened for a moment, and then turned toward Emily with a warm smile. "They said you can come today," she said gently. "Max is ready." The words echoed in Emily's chest like a song she hadn't heard in a long time. She rose from the kitchen table slowly, part nerves, part disbelief. Her fingers gripped the edge of her chair, as if making sure this was real. Half an hour later, she was in the back seat of the Andersons' car, her drawing pad resting on her lap. She had drawn Max again that morning, this time with kind eyes and his paw gently resting on hers. She hoped reality would match the picture. The shelter wasn't far. It looked plain from the outside, just a white building with a blue sign and a few trees shading the parking lot. But inside, it held something Emily had been missing for weeks, a part of her heart. Dennis met them at the door. "He's in the outdoor yard," he said. "We've kept him calm, worked slowly, and made sure he felt safe. He's shown no aggression for days. But we'll take this at your pace." Emily nodded. Her throat felt tight. and her hands were cold, but she was ready. They walked through the hallway, past kennels filled with other dogs, until they reached a gate that opened into a large, grassy yard. The breeze moved gently across the space, and the sun spilled across the ground like gold dot. Max stood on the far side of the yard, his coat clean and shining in the sun. He looked healthier, lighter somehow. He didn't seem to notice the gate opening until Emily stepped in. She paused just inside the fence. Max turned his head slowly, his ears perked up. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, frozen in place like the world had stopped moving. Then Emily whispered, "Hi, buddy." Max tilted his head. She took one cautious step forward. Max didn't growl. She took another, then another, until she stood about 10 feet away from him. She reached into her hoodie pocket and pulled out the same old tennis ball, the one she'd kept since the backyard dot. Max stared at it. Emily gave it a gentle toss across the yard, and then he ran. Not just ran, he bolted like a streak of joy across the grass, picked up the ball, and turned toward her. His tail wagged wildly, his ears bouncing with every step. As he approached her, Emily dropped to her knees and held out her arms. Unsure what he would do next, Max didn't hesitate. He dropped the ball and pushed his head into her chest, letting out a soft whine, like a sigh of relief. Emily wrapped her arms around his neck and buried her face into his fur. It smelled like fresh soap and warmth. Her tears came suddenly, fast and full of everything she'd been holding in. "I missed you," she whispered. "I knew you were still in there." Max licked her cheek and let out a small bark, this time playful, not threatening. Dennis watched from a distance, his arms crossed and his eyes misty. "That's the dog she knew," he said quietly to Mrs. Anderson. He just needed to remember who he was before everything went wrong. Emily and Max spent the next hour together, in the yard, playing, hugging, and rediscovering each other. When it was time to leave, Max gently followed her to the gate and sat beside her like he had done 100 times before. As they drove home, Emily sat with her hand resting on the back seat, where Max's leash was clipped. He leaned against her arm, eyes half closed. She didn't need words. The silence between them was full of everything that had been broken and now, slowly, was being repaired. He wasn't just her dog again. He was her healing. A week after Emily reunited with Max, a video was shared online by the animal shelter. It had been filmed quietly during their visit, with permission. In it, Emily stood in the middle of a grassy yard as Max sprinted toward her, tail wagging and eyes wide with joy. He dropped a tennis ball at her feet and leaned gently into her chest, letting her wrap her arms around him. The video was only 45 seconds long, but within hours, it was being shared across the country. People were drawn in by the caption, "She never gave up on her dog even when the world did." What began as a few thousand views quickly became millions. TV stations picked up the story. Blogs wrote about it. Headlines everywhere read, "Girl and dog reunited after emotional abuse case, a story of loyalty and love." Reporters began reaching out to the shelter, to the school, even to the foster home. But Carla made sure to protect Emily's privacy. When it came time to tell the story in full, it was Emily who chose how to share it and who to share it with. A local reporter named James Holloway had written an early, respectful article about her bravery in court. He didn't twist facts or add drama. So, when Emily agreed to one interview, she chose him. They met in the Andersons' garden on a warm Sunday morning. Max sat beside her, calm and content. James, a soft-spoken man with kind eyes, asked the first question gently. "Why did you want to speak now?" Emily looked down for a moment, then up at the camera. "Because I want people to know that just because someone doesn't hit you, doesn't mean they're not hurting you. And just because a dog listens to someone doesn't mean he trusts them." Max didn't turn on me. He was just scared. Her words echoed across the internet, touching hearts everywhere. The response was overwhelming. Letters poured in from other children who had felt voiceless. Parents wrote about their own struggles. Therapists shared how they were using Emily's interview to help teach emotional abuse awareness, and lawmakers listened. A local senator proposed a new bill that would expand protections for children with disabilities and improve oversight in reported cases of non-physical abuse, often overlooked but equally damaging. The bill, unofficially called Emily's Law, passed unanimously in state committee just weeks later. Meanwhile, Emily was invited to speak at a children's advocacy event. She stood at the podium, her notes in one hand and Max's leash in the other. The room fell silent as she spoke. "I thought I was alone for a long time. But I wasn't. There were people watching, listening, waiting for the right moment to help. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is tell someone what's happening, and sometimes, even a dog needs rescuing too. The audience rose to their feet. Cameras flashed. But more importantly, people listened. Emily's story became a symbol, not just of survival, but of hope. She didn't just get her dog back. She got her voice back. And in doing so, she helped others find theirs. Back at the Andersons' home, life began to settle. Emily continued her therapy and art classes. Max adapted quickly to the peaceful routine, curling beside her bed each night, like he'd never left. One morning, Emily drew a new picture. It was of her standing on a stage, microphone in hand, Max sitting proudly beside her. At the bottom, she wrote in neat handwriting, "This is the version of me I want to be." She placed the drawing in a frame and hung it beside her bed. As summer turned into fall, leaves drifted down the sidewalk outside their home. The world had changed in ways she never imagined, but Emily was ready for it, because love had returned, trust had been rebuilt, and her story, once full of sight, now heard loud and clear around the world.